G'day and welcome to the first major topic in the Painting Oathsworn series, painting Caucasian skin tones. Inevitably during the course of painting miniatures you need to find a good solid method for painting human skin, as it's one of the key elements that you'll find on almost every figure, and it's a really crucial part in making the model look alive. As discussed in the first video, for each figure we're choosing an overlay colour, and for the exile we're using a red-brown. Now this is a fantastic base for the skin as well as the leather and wood elements. Let's talk about a really common approach in miniature painting. It's called the inside out method. It's much easier to paint a model as if you were dressing it, starting from the skin and then working up through each successive layer of clothing, armour, etc. This approach will minimise mistakes, meaning you get less paint on areas you don't want it, which will reduce the time you spend fixing it. And that's why with this figure, we're starting on the skin. Let's get to it. All right, so as you can see, we are starting with Chimera Royal Brown for our overlay color. So I'm applying this through the airbrush. It helps to provide a smooth and even layer and actually reinforces a little bit of that zenithal prime by leaving the areas that are white a little bit richer and more alive looking than the areas that have been left in black. As I said in the introductory episode, you can do this with a dilute layer of paint or a wash or anything to create a very similar effect, and all we're doing is using it as a base tone to work from. These skin colors are just the ones that I've chosen for this particular figure. You'll see I change the skin colors on every model, and I think the key to understand about human skin and Caucasian skin is that it is very different and varied based on a lot of factors, including the environment, including the weather, the skin itself, whether it's textured, whether it's smooth. Really what you're trying to consider is less specific colors and more the richness of the skin. So a common mistake that I think people tend to make is they don't use enough saturated colors in skin. But if you're not familiar with the term saturated, it basically means a vibrant color that doesn't have a lot of gray. So I'll talk about that a little bit later on. So here you can see I'm taking the very first layer straight on top of the zenithal prime with the overlay color. And so this is just a combination of red leather from Vallejo and Chimera Royal Brown. The reason I've chosen this red leather is I want this Scar Tribe Exile to look like he's got a fairly tan and skin that's been outdoors a lot. How great's this, by the way? You can just pull the arm out and it frees up all of that space where you can get in there into the nooks and crannies. Fantastic. So the red leather is a warm orangey color that is going to help contribute to the outdoorsy looking skin. So rather than focus on specific colors, it's really important to think about what sort of skin you are trying to paint. And if you are looking at someone who spends more time inside, then you tend towards more pink colors rather than the warmer oranges as I'm using on this Scar Tribe. So what we're trying to achieve when painting skin and any volume in general really is to understand how it reacts in relation to the light. Part of the reason I chose to use a zenithal prime on these figures is it creates a very consistent lighting for all of the figures. And so that means we have a clear direction for where our highlights should be applied, and that is from the top down. So you can see that I'm treating each of these surfaces as a volume that is being lit from above, and the term volume just means a surface area. So we move on to the second layer now, and this color is a little bit closer to what you might equate skin to, and it is a warmer color that we've mixed in our previous layer. So I think the best piece of advice I can give anyone who's looking to improve their painting in general, more layers will equate to a smoother gradient, but it's really crucial that you understand that more layers doesn't necessarily mean more dilute paint. In fact, I think most painters that are trying to improve probably dilute their paint too much. It will create a much smoother transition using a more dilute paint, but at the expense of having really powerful and intense and vibrant colors, and also the main focus of why I paint and what I want these videos to focus on, which is getting models ready for a game. Mixing each stage in with the previous stage is crucial, but important that you consider how dilute your paint is, because it will make a difference in how much time you spend. So each of these little surface areas, I am respecting the direction of the light, and sometimes you'll see I leave a little bit of those underlying colors showing through, and other times you'll see I'm going back in and just reinforcing the coat that I've already done, just to help solidify where I want those very clear light sources. Now this chest is a really great example of a different approach to lighting on miniatures than most people would be used to. So if you think about how you would traditionally highlight a chest piece such as this, you would immediately highlight the raised areas and shadow in the recessed areas. However, because we've gone for a light from above, if you think about how the light would react to this surface, there is actually a highlight on the central line between the two pectoral muscles. It's a pretty key difference to how most painters are taught to paint to begin with. Rather than shadows in the recesses and highlights on the raised areas, we instead think about how that volume would react based on light. So again, all I'm doing here is continuing to build up the layers, and you can see this process, it doesn't take a massive amount of time for that area to start to look pretty good. And that's because of the underlying overlay colors and zenithal prime. So I'm going to be taking these figures to a standard that I like to call tabletop. I'm sure most people would consider these slightly better than tabletop, but for me this is a quick and straightforward paint job where I'm trying to achieve a result that looks really good on the table and is very quick to do. So most of these figures in this series I've painted in approximately 2 hours from start to finish. So sometimes it's important to reinforce those layers, and again, the more dilute your paint is, the more you may need to reinforce these layers. In this instance, I am simply trying to ensure that I've got every area covered. So we move on to the next layer, and this is much closer to a mid-tone. Now you've probably already seen on my palette that little white blob at the top. That's just a medium that I use. It's called Joe Sonia Magic Mix, and I find it helps create smoother transitions. It isn't necessary you can achieve the same result with water. I'm just really used to using it. So this color that we're using now is the main skin color, the main mid-tone. And we want this to cover the majority of this surface area. Sometimes I think painters go a little bit too high with their highlights and don't leave enough of this really rich, saturated mid-tone on the figure. And that results in models looking a little bit more pallid or a little bit more pastel than is ideal. So as I progress in painting this figure, you'll see I have a few different ways of helping to control the saturation and the vibrancy of the color. The first is making sure this section is the predominant layer, but I also have other tricks that we'll talk about a little bit later on. So again, really important that we're respecting where the light source is, and you can see we're leaving a little bit more space each time, showing a little bit of those underlying layers. This is a pretty basic miniature painting methodology, layering, where you're building up stages of color and creating those smooth transitions by a little bit less color each time. And again, as we look at this chest, you can see how it's a little bit different to how painters normally approach a surface like this. But as we look at this chest, you'll see it looks a little bit more accurate to real life. I think the face is a great area to really understand volumes, and it really helps me to break down the face into those separate sections. So Again, the cheekbone is really a sphere, and so we want there to be a raised highlight in the central part of the cheekbone. The lips, the upper lip area, the nose, all of these have really clearly defined areas where there should be light as soon as you start to think about where the direction of the light source is coming from. So the bridge of the nose and each of these surface areas on top of the forehead and the temple. So the reason I chose the Nocturna Natural Flesh is it's a slightly darker than normal mid-tone, and it's a little bit more tan. So we'll move into our first highlight, and the color that I'm mixing into this basic mid-tone is Sunny Skin Tone. And you can see that this is still a very warm and vibrant color, even though it is quite light. And again, that's just feeding into what I'm trying to achieve out of our skin tone, which is to keep it really alive looking. As soon as you introduce white or really light colors, you tend to see your skin tone losing vibrancy and looking a little bit more like a zombie, and we want to avoid that. And I think it's really important to highlight here, no pun intended, how different I am approaching the highlights. Most of the time when you think about highlighting volumes, you're thinking about the raised areas receiving the highlights and the recesses receiving the shadows. In this case, as I've said, we are looking at where the light source is coming from and instead how we place our highlights based on that information. Because I've been painting figures for such a long time, I have a pretty good control of where my brush is going. And so I tend to make a lot of really quick strokes that usually go exactly where I want them to. It's okay if your brush doesn't do exactly the same thing. All you have to do is slow yourself down a little bit and just make sure you're taking a little bit more time. So we're going to use a glaze after this layer just to soften these transitions a little bit. They look a little bit stark at the moment, and so a glaze is a dilute version of basically the same color. And the important part about the glaze is the direction of the brush stroke. So the direction of the brush stroke will really determine where the majority of the pigment is deposited, and we want the pigment to be deposited in the center of the highlight. So you'll see I often drag my brush from the shadow area into the highlight area when I'm doing a glaze. So we're doing a glaze now, and this glaze is coming from the shadow into the raised area. All the glaze is doing is depositing lots of tiny bits of pigment into that area, softening the transitions. So we're going to go on to our final highlight, and we're going to use a pure Sunny Skin Tone. I'm sure you've seen that little bit of paper towel just beside my palette. It's really a crucial part of painting, is understanding that you can use any dilution of paint that you like. However, you need to wipe it off on a towel before you go to the model, because if your paint is too dilute, it will flood the figure. So I always have that paper towel there, and that'll be a good gauge for you in terms of how much dilution you'll need to have on your paint to achieve similar results. So these highlights are intended to be really specifically placed, vibrant, what I like to call pop lights. We don't want this to cover the majority of the surface. And at this point in time, I think it's important that I explain a general philosophy that I have towards miniature painting. So I like to have really vibrant, highly contrasted models because they look better on the table when you're playing a game. And so my general approach towards miniature painting is one that I like to call over contrast and under deliver. No, my general approach to miniature painting is I over contrast and then refine. So we sketch in really bright, high value highlights, and then we bring those highlights down and soften the transitions with some glazing. As we move on to mixing this next colour, you'll see that I've brought a new colour into the mix, which is a Vallejo Model Air. Now this Vallejo Model Air is called Elf Flesh. If you're ever struggling with glazing and how glazing works, the best thing I can recommend is to grab yourself an airbrush paint, specifically designed for an airbrush paint. Because the way that the airbrush paint is designed, it's heavily pigmented, but it's also really dilute. So you'll find that glazing with a color like this, it helps deposit more pigment in a more dilute layer. So you'll find there's a much better result with your glazes in using a color like that. This is exactly the same as applying with an airbrush, what I'm doing right now. It's just, it takes a little bit longer to achieve the same result. So we are depositing lots of tiny pigments all over the surface. We're trying to be a little bit careful and not get it in the deepest shadows. And all this is doing is really smoothing out the transitions and making sure that the highlights are a little bit more even rather than the rough sketching that I've done. So this is my process in a nutshell. We sketch really sharp, quick highlights that have a lot of high contrast, and then we use these glazes to smooth them, to bring them back down into a little bit more normal color. So this next step is utilizing my airbrush. So as I just demonstrated, this is not an essential part. You can achieve exactly what I'm about to achieve with this with your brush. This just is a quicker process, and I'm quite a big fan of using my airbrush because I have a lot of fun doing it. So what I'm doing is I am glazing over these areas, and the airbrush color I've chosen is a little bit lighter than the basic mid-tone, and we're being very careful with the direction we're shooting the airbrush. We're trying to leave those shadows in there, but really focus the light. So the reason I like using the airbrush is it really creates a nice soft looking color. But one thing it can also do is really reduce the intensity of the color as it creates a really pastel finish. So as I talked about a little bit earlier in the episode, it's really crucial to have intense, vibrant, alive looking skin. When I used the airbrush just then, what it did is it really softened the transitions, but it did give the skin a very pastel quality. So I'm using an intense saturated color as a filter over the skin. And one of the colors I like to use for this is actually contrast paints. So I'm adding lots of different layers of warm skin and red colors to help create a sense of being alive. You know, human skin has all of the veins and musculature working underneath, and I think this is my method for helping to make that feel like it's the case for these figures. So once I've completed using the airbrush to smooth and add some richness into the skin, the next stage is to go back with a brush and add some of those really small details and some of those really crucial highlight areas. This figure has a lot of really awesome scarring and texturing, and with the brush I really want to reinforce the light in those areas to help draw attention to them. And it's also a good opportunity to add little things like the knee texture, the skin folds around the knee, and draw a little bit more attention to the face and to those really high value highlight areas. So you can see this layer is still pretty vibrant. Still got some richness of color in it. But this is the last stage on the skin in terms of making it look finished. One thing I find a lot of painters do is they don't respect how a figure's going to look when it's all finished. So the skin tone right now is sitting next to a lot of brown. So sometimes that will trick your eye into thinking that it looks lighter or darker than it actually is, because everything is influenced by its environment. So rather than saying this skin is finished and I've done everything I need to do, it's always good to go and finish other areas on the figure to get a better sense of if the skin looks right or if it needs more work. Usually, there will be more work that I'll do on the skin just to smooth out or increase vibrancy in certain areas. And as we're heading further and further up on the figure, we want to have a brighter highlight to really draw focus to the face, which is in many ways the most important part of the figure. So this is the last step with the brush around the basic skin tone. And you can see there is still some elements of the skin that are a little bit rougher and a little bit more textured. That's a cool effect. We want to have a really clear mindset that we're looking for a result that looks cool on the table. So we're about to switch to the very last stage, and before we switch, I want you to take a close look at the skin and then compare it to how the skin looks in this next shot. What you might find is that the skin tone feels really different and looks like a different color. It's actually exactly the same color. All that's changed is the other areas around it. That's a really important lesson. Don't judge something as finished until you've done other areas around it. In the final stage, I am just going to add some fresh blood into the scratches and scars on the exile. This looks like it's a black on my palette, but I'm actually again using the contrast paint Flesh Tearers Red. It's a fantastic, intense, vibrant color that will help make those scars look a little bit shiny and a little bit alive. And that's the last stage of the skin. And that brings to a close this first episode. Now, I appreciate there was a lot of elements that were painted off screen, but don't worry, future episodes will cover on topics such as fur, steel, wood, and in the next episode, we will be looking at painting leather and painting black, which can be a challenging color. And to do that, we're going to use the Cur. So I will see you in the next episode. Big Deno.